Quick spoiler to grab your attention at the start. Yes, there are situations where the 4060 loses to the 3060. It's not the most common result, but it does happen in games that are using a lot of VRAM. More benchmarks in a second. First, let's talk about what am I reviewing against? I'm going to do a series of videos, but today's day one video is for a card to launch at $300 and for me to consider it a good recommended GPU, it would need to beat the card I have already been recommending at the $300 price point for several months now. The RX 6700 XT, at least in the US market, has been available for around $300 for quite a while now. Yes, I understand its MSRP was like $480 or something stupid like that, but it's been a very good deal at around $300 for a while now. So the 4060 is going to need to beat that. That's what I've been recommending at this price point. However, the 3060 12GB, we should also compare how does it do against that, and also where does this thing cost right now. One of the best things about the 4060 is that it actually has a lower MSRP than the 3060 at $300, whereas the 3060 came out at $330, but the 3060 has been available at $280 on the actual market for a little over a month now, since the 4060 Ti announcement, pretty much. These kind of dropped in price to around $280. Now, the specific cooler models I'm using, by the way, I do test everything at their out-of-the-box settings, which does include ResizeBAR and Smart Access Memory turned on. I always get comments asking that. The RX 6700 XT I'm testing is the reference model, which is not the best cooler. You can certainly get better results with an OC and all of that on other cards. The temps are a little bit high. The 4060 is the Asus Dual. This is what I was sent for testing by NVIDIA. I think that means they probably don't have a Founders Edition of the 4060. And then the 3060 I have is actually the Strix cooler from Asus. I'm not doing that to attempt to skew the results. That's just, honestly, I was buying GPUs when I started my channel during the whole crypto boom where GPUs were being scalped all the time. I happened to find an in-stock 3060 Strix from an actual retailer that was more expensive than it should be, but was much lower than scalper pricing, so that's why I have the Strix cooler. Anyway, I think that's what you need to know for us to jump into the benchmarks, and then I'll give you some final thoughts at the end. Let's start with some PlayStation 5 exclusives that have been ported to PC, some of which have been very memory hungry, like Forspoken at its ultra-high preset, which does include some ray tracing. We can see the 12GB cards definitely going over 8GB, and that's causing problems for the 8GB 4060. It is basically tied with the RTX 3060 12GB, which does not look good for a generational advancement, and the 6700 XT is actually 31% ahead of the 3060, and definitely ahead of the 4060 as well, and that is at 1080p Ultra. If we go up to 1440p Ultra, we now see the 3060 12GB still basically tied with the 4060, but now it actually is ahead. Now, let me be clear, this is not going to be a typical result that we see much of, although this is not going to be the only instance it happens in this video where the last generation 3060 product is actually ahead of the RTX 4060 due to having 12GB instead of 8. The 6700 XT here is 21% ahead of the 4060, and this does include ray tracing in this benchmark. Now, another PlayStation 5 title that has been very VRAM hungry on PC is The Last of Us Part 1. However, it has received a lot of patches since the initial launch, which has improved performance at lower and lowered VRAM issues a bit. It still wants more than 8 at 1080p Ultra, although here we do see the 4060 22% ahead of the 3060 and the 6700 XT 35% ahead of the 3060, and the 1% lows here look very similar. All cards here are actually very playable with the 3060 over 60 FPS on average, and the other two cards even further ahead. Now, if we reduce down to the high preset, it's designed to stay better within an 8GB buffer. And interestingly here, we actually see it's the 6700 XT, which seems to take off a little bit relative to the other two. Anyway, it is what it is. So at 1080p high settings, the 4060 is 21% ahead of the 3060 12GB. VRAM capacity does not seem to be an issue here, but the 6700 XT is 45% ahead of the 3060. So the 4060 is kind of falling right in between those two GPUs. Now, when we move up to 1440p Ultra settings, The 6700 XT can get us very close to a 60 FPS experience, although it is below it at times. Whereas the 4060 and 3060 are basically neck and neck again, although there is a small lead in the 1% lows for the 3060 over its next-gen counterpart of the 4060. Now, again, we're seeing not a good look, where the 3060 and 4060 are basically tied due to spilling over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. However, realistically, playing at high settings at 1440p probably does make more sense anyway due to the lower frame rate. If you wanted to hit 60 frames per second, you'd probably tweak settings anyway. And here we now do see the 4060 pulling 17% ahead of the 3060 and 19% in the 1% lows, although the 6700 XT is running out ahead of both of them. It's 46% ahead of the 3060. Its averages are in the mid-70s, and even the 1% lows around 70. There's another PlayStation 5 exclusive that's been ported to PC that I test, which is Returnal at its maximum preset, which is the Epic preset. It doesn't use any ray tracing, although the game has it. It's not part of the maximum preset, so I didn't turn it on here. And here we're seeing this game doesn't use as much VRAM as the other two PS5 games we've taken a look at here. And the 4060 is 20% ahead of the 3060, 31% ahead in the 1% lows, and the 6700 XT is 35% ahead of the 3060. So once again, the 4060 kind of falling in between. And moving up to 1440p, again at the Epic preset, we once again see the 4060 falling in between the performance of the 3060 12GB and the 6700 XT. And here, the 4060 is good for about a 60 FPS average, but the 6700 XT is pulling closer to 70 FPS, although it's a little bit shy of it. And the 3060 is hanging out a little bit over 50 FPS range at 1440p Epic. Let's move on to some cross-platform games, although current gen only. And this is Star Wars Jedi Survivor, which uses Unreal Engine 4, pushed all the way to its limits. And at 1080p Epic settings, we actually see all GPUs giving very good experience here, with the 3060 at around 60 frames per second, the 4060 18% ahead of that, and the 6700 XT is 45% ahead of the 3060. So again, pulling well ahead of the other two GPUs. Now, if we turn on ray tracing, keep it at the Epic preset, but turn on ray tracing, the 4060 is now still right around 60 FPS, but the 3060 has dropped down into the upper 40s, around 50 probably by the end of the benchmark run. The 6700 XT is still a little bit ahead of the RTX 4060, despite this being a ray tracing enabled benchmark. Now, this isn't the most demanding ray tracing game. We'll certainly test some heavier ones later on, but in lighter ray tracing workloads like this, the 6700 XT is ahead of the RTX 4060. Moving up to 1440p Epic preset. Now, none of our GPUs are quite at a 60 FPS experience, although the 6700 XT is 60 FPS at times and is going to finish this run just a little shy of it in the mid-50s, whereas the 4060 is down in the mid-40s, 3060 is under 40 FPS average. The 4060 is 16% ahead of the 3060, and the 6700 XT was 42% ahead of the 3060. But what if we turn on ray tracing? If we turn on ray tracing, all of them have their performance dip. The 6700 XT is still in the mid-40s, though. It's pretty playable on a controller, which a lot of people would use a controller for this type of game. And it's still a little bit ahead of the RTX 4060, despite this being a ray tracing enabled title. Again, could be a light ray tracing workload. Also, though, the 6700 XT and the 3060 are trying to go over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so that's probably holding back the 4060 here a little bit. Now, let's go ahead and move on to Unreal Engine 5. Layers of Fear is going to be probably a lot easier to run than the bigger spectacle games that we'll see later on with Unreal Engine 5, but this is the first fully released third-party Unreal Engine 5 game, and at 1080p high, we see the 4060 22% ahead of the 3060, and the 6700 XT 28% ahead of the 3060. Turning ray tracing on, which is basically using the Lumen lighting system still, but in its hardware accelerated version, we now see the RTX 4060 slightly ahead of the 6700 XT. It's 18% ahead of the 3060, and the 6700 XT is 14% ahead of the 3060, so a very small win, although the 1% lows are a little bit further ahead. If we jump up to 1440p resolution, and by the way, the high preset in this game is as high as it goes. It doesn't go beyond high. This is the maximum preset the game offers. I thought I should probably clarify that. We see the 4060 kind of splitting the difference between the 3060 and the 6700 XT. It's only 14% ahead of the 3060. The 6700 XT is 25% ahead of the 3060. And once again, when we turn on ray tracing, the 4060 and the 6700 XT are providing much the same sort of experience, although the 4060 is slightly ahead. And in the 1% lows, slightly more ahead, but still not a massive difference. And again, the 4060 is only 19% ahead of the 3060 here. And let's jump into a Plague Tale Requiem. This is not Unreal Engine. This is the developer's own custom engine here at 1080p Ultra settings. We once again see the 4060 kind of splitting the difference between the 3060 and the 6700 XT. This game is not particularly VRAM hungry, so the 4060 16% ahead of the 3060 and the 6700 XT 29% ahead of the 3060, so the 4060 falling in between there. So once again, and also not a whole heck of a lot to see in the 1% lows here, also kind of just splitting the difference. If we go up to 1440p Ultra settings, all of the GPUs are struggling a bit here, but the 6700 XT is still definitely the furthest ahead. The 4060's lost a little bit of ground compared to the other two. It's now 13% ahead of the 3060, whereas the 6700 XT is 32% ahead. Now, I will mention, though, that this game does feature DLSS frame generation and does not have an FSR2 implementation. So if you were using upscaling tech, there would be an advantage there for the NVIDIA GPUs. Now, an advantage for the AMD GPUs is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. If we test it out at the 1080p balance settings, all the GPUs here are delivering a high frame rate experience. I think you'd very much be able to enjoy the game. But the 4060 is 25% ahead of the 3060 here, and the 6700 XT is 49% ahead of the 3060. And generally, I think this game seems to like cache, not money cache, although it likes that as well, I'm sure. But if we move up to 1440p balanced, we're now seeing the 4060 24% ahead of the 3060, but the 6700 XT has moved up to 56% ahead of the 3060. And yeah, this game tends to be a standout title for AMD GPUs, but I've noticed some of the 40 series GPUs from NVIDIA closing a bit more of that gap, and so I'm wondering, like I said, that it might be the fact that they have the larger L2 cache, similar to how the 6000 series has the Infinity cache. Not sure. But hey, you want to see another game where the 3060 pulls ahead of the 4060? Let's look at some cross-gen games. Here we have Resident Evil 4 Remake at the 1080p max setting, which includes ray tracing. We use a lot more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and that sees the 3060 pull 14% ahead of the 4060, and the 6700 XT is 39% ahead of the 4060. The 1% lows are even more crazy, with a 71% lead for the 3060 over the 4060, and over doubling the 1% lows on the 6700 XT. Now, if we reduce it to the prioritized graphics preset, which I had some issues with, where it was enabling FSR2 quality on some GPUs but not others, which I noticed partway through my testing, and I ended up just having FSR2 enabled on all of them at the quality setting. Anyway, now they're back more into line with what we've been seeing more regularly, which is the 4060 about 21% ahead of the 3060, and the 6700 XT 30% ahead of the 3060. Whereas if we go up to 1440p and go back to the maximum settings, which once again does include ray tracing, and I'm not upscaling, we now see once again the 3060 pulling ahead of the 4060. So yeah, that's a bit rough here for the new gen card. Again, obviously you can tweak settings to avoid this, and it's even kind of worse in the 1% lows. But yeah, it's not good when you can find, even if they're outlier cases, where your newer generation product loses to the older generation product. That just doesn't look good. At 1440p prioritized graphics, but once again, with FSR2 quality enabled, they once again pull into a more similar pattern with the 4060 20% ahead of the 3060, although the 6700 XT pulls 38% ahead of the 3060 here. So the 4060 kind of splitting that difference, and they're all offering very high frame rate experiences at those settings. Let's look at one more cross-generation game with Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p Ultra. And the 4060 here is only 11% ahead of the 3060. And the 6700 XT is only 25% ahead of the 3060, but that still makes the 4060 kind of splitting the difference. And again, an 11% lead and only 9% in the 1% lows. It doesn't look that great for the 4060 here. The 6700 XT is 29% ahead of the 3060 in the 1% lows. Now, if we move up to 1440p resolution, the 4060 dips to a single-digit percentage lead over the 3060, coming in with a 9% lead on average and 8% in the 1% lows, whereas the 6700 XT is 29% ahead of the 3060 and 30% in the 1% lows. The 6700 XT is averaging just shy of 60 frames per second through this benchmark run, whereas the 4060 is just shy of 50 frames per second through this benchmark run. Now, what about going with some upscaling technology? We should touch on that. It is a distinguishing factor between the GPUs. So at 1440p ultra settings, there's no ray tracing yet. If we enable quality upscaling, so that's DLSS on the NVIDIA GPUs and FSR2 quality on the AMD GPU, which I don't think looks as stable, especially in motion. So image quality advantage here for DLSS. You can look at some other videos. Hardware Unbox has done a good image quality comparison here. That's not really what I'm getting into here. But here the 4060 is only 6% ahead of the 3060 when you don't enable frame generation. The 6700 XT performance-wise is 26% ahead of the 3060, but again, image quality not quite as good. 1% lows are very similar. Now, frame generation, I'm also showing the results. Notice it does pull it ahead of the 6700 XT, but it's not helping the, there's some more additional image quality artifacts that can come up as well as some latency considerations to consider. I've done other videos talking a lot more about that, so it's not an apples to apples comparison. It's not a real 80 FPS experience like you would get on another GPU. It's also not super far ahead of where the 6700 XT was with native frames. Anyway, let's look at some heavy-duty ray tracing. So at 1080p RT Ultra in Cyberpunk 2077, we do see the 6700 XT finally pull into last place, with the 3060 15% ahead and the 4060 31% ahead. The 1% lows, it's 20% ahead on the 3060, 35% ahead on the 4060, but none of them have a very good frame rate. They're all around 30 frames per second. Which means none of them actually handle heavy-duty ray tracing at 1080p very well. None of them do. You would have to rely on upscaling and or frame generation. Look at the frame generation frame time graph right now. It's stuttering. I'm curious if it's spilling over its VRAM capacity because the 3060 is pushing right at about 8 gigabytes and frame generation uses a little bit more than that. So its 1% lows are actually worse on the 4060 than on the 3060. Again, I think there could be a bit of a VRAM-related issue there with FrameGen. Anyway, I do think the 4060 offers the best possible experience out of the GPUs if you're using upscaling at 1080p to do heavy-duty ray tracing and then maybe using FrameGen. Maybe we're running into VRAM issues, though, on that, so this is not incredibly compelling, although it is certainly doing something that the other GPUs are struggling to do as well. And I'll talk to you more about it in my final thoughts section. So for the RTX 4060 to win this review, if there is such a thing, it would need to replace my current recommendation for a $300 graphics card, which has been the 6700 XT. Doing a little bit of division, and based on the PC part picker lowest prices available new, the 6700 XT costs 3% more than the RTX 4060's MSRP. And does it usually deliver better than that in terms of performance? Yeah, there are some situations like this extreme example where the 4060 is behind in the pack, but even in many other situations where we're not VRAM constrained by choosing settings that don't have a VRAM constraint, we do usually see the 6700 XT noticeably better performance than the 4060, and that is in the vast majority of situations. The only couple of situations we saw where the 4060 could match the performance was with ray tracing enabled, and still often with ray tracing enabled, like in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, RT on, the 6700 XT usually still had a small lead. These are in lighter ray tracing workloads. So the only situation where we saw a noticeable win for the 4060 over the 6700 XT was when we turned on some heavy-duty ray tracing. But the thing is, if we actually look at the frame rate numbers up here, when we do this, the 4060 at 1080p RT Ultra is only getting barely over 30 frames per second. Okay, so that's the thing, is that it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory when it takes cripplingly difficult ray tracing settings to pull noticeably ahead of the competition. Now, that being said, NVIDIA does have an upscaling advantage, and so when you do enable upscaling, it does look better. It also has the option of using frame generation, although we did see some stutters on the frame time graph when I enabled that at DLSS quality. I thought it could be the fact that we're right up against an 8 gigabytes of VRAM already at these settings, and then frame generation might be using just a little bit over the top on that. And when NVIDIA gave a chance to show off RT and DLSS early on this GPU, they were wanting it to show with DLSS balanced. And I'm wondering if that was part of the reason why, although also we're under 60 frames per second a lot more when we're using DLSS quality here. And the problem is that DLSS at 1080p doesn't look great, especially when you have to use it pretty aggressively. Now, frame generation itself, I have less of an issue with. For example, if we were when I did my 1440p ultra testing with DLSS enabled and then FrameGen, I have less of a problem with this. DLSS quality at 1440p looks pretty good, and FrameGen from a high enough base frame rate, which this is kind of pushing up against, is reasonable, but it doesn't always get you this massive boost. Like, that's not that big of a boost. And is it even that far ahead of the 6700 XT without frame generation, although DLSS does look better than FSR2? So the main thing I'd say here is that the 4060 has to really reach for those special features to find any reason to recommend it over 6700 XT. And so in the vast majority of games, of current gen games that I'm testing here, we see the 6700 XT with a noticeable win over the RTX 4060. And the higher the settings and the more VRAM hungry that they get, the larger that gap can be, even to the point where we can see the 3060 12 gigabyte even pulling ahead of the 4060, although this was a pretty isolated result. Usually when the VRAM was an issue, it wasn't having the 4060 end up behind, it was more frequently ending up about tied. So that brings me to my next question. Should you buy a 3060 12 gigabyte instead of a 4060 8 gigabyte? So if we jump back to the calculator for a second, at current pricing, the 4060 is 7% more expensive than the $280 price point where you can find the cheapest 3060 12 gigabytes. And it does usually offer, other than in situations where you're spilling over the VRAM capacity, which you can adjust settings like going down to high, for example, to remove that barrier, it is usually more than 7% faster. Now, you do have that issue where, okay, you're going to have to be more mindful of your VRAM capacity, which is a little bit annoying. But in general, if somebody, let me put it this way, if somebody was offering me a 3060 12 gigabyte or 4060 8 gigabyte, I would take the 4060. It is usually noticeably faster. Oftentimes 20% faster, but as we've seen, it can be down in the teens or even, single-digit percentage wins, or even, again, in some outlier cases where the VRAM's particularly heavy, it can come out behind. But like I said, I think that is more of the exception rather than the rule. So if you offer me both cards, I would take the 4060. There's a few other nice things to point out. It's only drawing 100 watts a lot of the time, whereas the other two GPUs are closer to 180 or more watts a lot of the time. So also, I think RDNA 2 underreports its wattage to the program I'm using here, because I don't think it reports the entire board power. I think it's just the GPU power. So the 6700 XT is drawing the most power here. So if you were like trying to upgrade something with a pretty small power supply and didn't want to mess with the power supply, I mean, maybe that would also be something to take into consideration. But just in general, I do think the 4060 is a better GPU. It's much more energy efficient. It's usually, and I'm talking compared to the 3060 here. It's much more energy efficient. It is usually faster, although you will have to be more mindful of settings that could be spilling over your VRAM, where it doesn't usually take a loss, but can, as we're seeing here. But then it does, again, have frame generation, which is nice. It's a nice to have. I've, again, talked about this so much in other videos. It's a situational feature. It adds a bit of latency, so you're not going to want to use it in competitive situations. And it, not every game has it. And even if it does have it, you need a high enough base frame rate for it to be good. And then depending on the game, image quality, especially depending on what's going on with HUD elements in the games and things like that, sometimes those don't play nicely with frame generation. I still do think it's a nice to have, and I do use it myself in certain games. I liked it a lot in Plague Tale. I actually do use it sometimes in Cyberpunk, actually without using DLSS quality. I just use frame generation with no upscaling, because I actually find sometimes the image artifacts, again, when you're at a high enough base frame rate, are actually sometimes less noticeable with frame generation than they are with the upscaling tech, which I find sometimes has issues with aliasing in motion and things like that. Anyway, that's really a topic for another video, but it is, again, a value-added feature. So yeah, I would definitely think the 4060 is an upgrade overall. It also has an AV1 encoder that the 3060 and the 6700 XT don't, which is good for streaming to YouTube right now, I think is the supported streaming app on that one. So all in all, is the 4060 better than the 3060? Yes. By very much? No. If it came in at the same MSRP as the 3060, this would be an extreme disaster. The fact that they did actually reduce its MSRP to $300 instead of $330 at least goes some way towards me not hating the card as much as I could have. But I do think it would have been a lot nicer to see around the $250 mark and called a 4050 or a 4050 Ti. That would have been an exciting card. At $300, until they dry up and aren't available, I'm going to recommend the 6700 XT, unless you just have to have NVIDIA. And so that will be the last thing that I will mention here is if you are deciding between GPUs, they have their strengths and weaknesses. And if you're deciding between AMD and NVIDIA, I'm reviewing gaming performance here. If you use your GPU for professional workloads, you're going to want to research that topic separately. There are a lot of apps that are programmed with the market leader in mind, CUDA core acceleration, that kind of thing. I think things like Blender and all that. Again, I'm not an expert on productivity apps. I test gaming performance. You're going to want to look into whether your workload would work well on an AMD GPU. And if you're using these for productivity, that's another interesting thing to talk about between the 3060 and the 4060. Because in certain productivity apps, VRAM capacity is actually very important, and having 12 gigabytes on a slightly slower card might actually be better than having 8 gigabytes on a slightly faster card. So again, I'm not testing productivity apps in this video, but I would highly encourage you, if you're buying a GPU in this price range for productivity reasons, that you research your workflow. First of all, is it supported well on AMD? And if it's not and you're buying NVIDIA, is the 12 gigabytes of VRAM capacity going to be more helpful than the slightly faster GPU and the AV1 encoder? So just things to consider. Overall, again, I considered for the 4060 to win this review, it would have to disrupt my current recommendation in the $300 price point. One of the staples of my channel is a monthly GPU buyer guide, by price point. And if the 6700 XT remains available for around $300, it's going to continue to get my $300 GPU recommendation. I hope this was useful for you guys. I'm planning on doing a whole bunch more of these head-to-head type comparisons using the 4060 as well as all the other GPUs that I benchmarked to prepare for this. I have retested my 3050, my 3060 as you saw here, my 3060 Ti, my 4060, my 2060, I retested my 1066 gigabyte and a bunch of AMD GPUs. I retested my 6700 non-XT as well as the XT you saw in this video, my 6600 XT, my 6600 non-XT, as well as the the Intel Arc A750 and A770. So I've retested all of those GPUs in these same games and settings that you just saw here. And I'm planning on releasing a ton of head-to-head comparisons, both comparing them against the 4060, but we could also look at some that don't include the 4060. So I'm interested in the comment section, if you guys have, out of those GPUs I just listed, which ones you would like to see compared against each other. When I do these side-by-side comparisons, it's difficult to fit, these really work best with 2 GPUs. 3 is kind of the limit. When it gets to 4, it gets really cluttered on the screen, but is somewhat doable, which is why I don't do all of them in one single video, because I think there's a lot of value in being able to see things like the frame time graph and the stat counters up here, where if you reduce all of this down to a bar graphs with all the GPUs on it, I think that's extremely valuable, but lots of other channels bigger than mine already have you covered on bar graphs with all the GPUs on it. I think the value I can add to that is the more detailed head-to-head comparisons and follow-up coverage. So like I said, let me know what you guys want to see related to that. And a huge thank you to channel members who have clicked the join button, as well as channel subscribers. All of the support, guys, I spent so long benchmarking for all of those. It's lucky I'm on my summer break right now as a teacher, else I would not have had time to test all of those anyway. And having all of that support is the motivation required for me to be staying up late at night benchmarking things and editing together this footage. I'm very tired right now, and I have some other side-by-sides I need to start getting ready for my next few days worth of videos by the time you see this. Anyway, I hope all of you have an excellent day.